So during the golden era, uh, unions were much more powerful than they had been in the past. And so if we look at just union membership in the United States, that's the blue line here, and you can see that it increased throughout the 1930s, which isn't too surprising given the Great Depression. And then it stayed high after World War II for sort of 10 to 20 years. And then it started to slowly decline, and it's actually fairly low now compared to where it has been in the past. Another piece that went along with that was that government size increased, and so the government played a more active role in the economy. So government size is about 30% of GDP, so this is government revenue divided by GDP. Whereas, before World War II, it was more in the 10 to 15% range. And the unions had a fair amount of power. So the left axis here is days on strike per thousand workers. And it's the blue line. And you can see that there were actually some strikes. We don't have the data here before 1955, but there were quite a number of strikes right after the war. And then in the early 1950s, that started to come down. But then in the 1970s, it started to increase, and it peaked in the mid 1970s to late 1970s. And they were successful. Average wages relative to share price, which is sort of one measure of how much bargaining power workers have, also increased in the mid to late 1970s before falling down. So what really happened was that we had, as we've discussed before, these oil shocks and sort of an economy-wide productivity slowdown. And so, productivity had been growing very strongly in the 50s and 60s, then partly due to the oil price shocks of the 1970s, partly due to perhaps just chance, productivity growth fell. But workers still had a strong bargaining position, right? So they were able to go out and strike. They were able to capture still a lot of the growth, which meant that profits were lower, which meant that investment was lower, which meant that productivity growth was even lower. And so what we ended up with, if we think about our labor market model, instead of being up at point C, we end up at point D as the price setting curve shifts down. And we end up with both high inflation and high unemployment. So stagflation, which is just a term meaning stagnation or low growth with inflation, is really sort of what happened in the 1970s. So this is an average of advanced economies. In some ways, it was more stark in the United States, where we had, high inflation in the mid to late 1970s with unemployment that was increasing. The U.S. hit a high of unemployment of 10.8% in the early 1980s before it started to come down. And so you can think of that as an upward shift of the Phillips curve, is that this trade-off between unemployment and inflation really broke down because we had more and more inflation because of the strong wage growth in the 1970s, but high unemployment because of the low productivity growth and low investment. So this was more of a supply side crisis, right? The end of this era was very different than the Great Depression, which was more of a demand side crisis where we had, you know, investment falling and consumer spending falling. Now we had a supply side crisis. We had low rates of profit, low investment, and low productivity growth, which were all related, right? Low rates of profit lead to low investment, leads to low productivity growth, which then just leads to low profit again. And so the demand side policies that had been developed after the Great Depression really were not a good solution. And increasing either, fiscal policy or monetary policy could lead to perhaps lower unemployment, but then just higher inflation. And so what we really needed was something else.